Hello and welcome back. This is Cole Anderson, the independent pianist, coming to you again today. And I have to apologize, I've made use of yet another hyperbolic title today. Maybe I'm starting to take a little bit too much enjoyment in some viewers' rather strongly voiced objections to these sort of titles. Anyway, I do apologize. I'm quite aware that it is impossible to say who is genuinely the greatest Liszt player, or the greatest anything, in fact. This is all subjective. At the very least, I do use a question mark, so that does leave it open to interpretation. I just wanted to do this video because Liszt interpretation has always been kind of a sore point for me. Of all composers, I think Liszt is the one who's most consistently sinned against. A lot of pianists really make a hash of his greatest works, and then the audience reacts in kind and kind of writes Liszt off as a charlatan or a cheap piano composer. And I guess I just want to kind of set the record straight today, if that's possible, at least with whoever happens to see this video. As an example, I had the misfortune in my youth to hear a very poor rendition of Liszt's transcription of the Schumann song Venmo. The original song is very, very beautiful, and Liszt's transcription also, if properly played, is a wonderful, noble, and beautiful idea. Anyway, this performance I heard, was very clattery, not very singing at all in its approach. And then I had to hear someone in the audience loudly speaking to a friend afterwards saying, "I really don't like Liszt at all. He always has to overdo everything and make it bombastic," etc., etc. I really wanted to just shake them at that moment and say, no, this is the fault of the performer, not Liszt. I guess the injustice of it all just hits me very strongly. Anyway, that story came back to my mind in vivid detail recently because I stumbled across a recording that I haven't heard in many, many years, but which really filled me with amazement. I had forgotten, if I had known before, how great it was. That was Arrau's recording of Liszt's B minor Ballade. And I wouldn't blame you if you've never heard of this piece before. The Ballade is not as well known as it should be, despite being one of his greatest works. It was written around the same time that he was working on the B minor sonata, and it's really a companion piece to that work, and it really is one of his most moving compositions. Of many passages which stand out for me, I have to highlight the climax of the work. For those of you who know the piece, this is probably the most famous passage, in which the melody is in the mid-range, and there are these magnificent kind of glittering scales which cover the entire keyboard. So before I say anything about Arrau's performance or anyone else's, let's just hear Arrau's version of this segment. So what immediately struck me when I heard this was how emotionally rich and inflected Arrau's playing is here, without being indulgent. There's a wonderful natural flow, a give and take to his playing. At the same time, he even fills the technical elements with an amazing expression and soul. That's the only way I can think to characterize it. Just to make this stand out in more relief, let's compare this with another very good but more normal version. There are many that I could pick from. This is Yukine Kuroki, I think that's how you say the name. A wonderful pianist. She was the winner at the recent Liszt competition in Utrecht. So this is very solid, serious playing. There's nothing wrong with it at all, but at the same time, she actually misses out on some of the possibilities. She plays the melody with great expression, but the scales remain simply expressions of technique, where with Arrau, he manages to transform them into something very expressive as well. So in particular, I want to highlight this moment as we listen to Arrau one more time, where he kind of stretches out the top of this scale. It's just a moment of incredible beauty for me.
「
Arrau's version, it's the interplay between the melody, the real melody, and the scalar melody that really creates this wonderful sense of fullness and richness to what he does. So at that moment, I was really thinking to myself, oh my God, this is some of the best Liszt playing I've ever heard. And for some reason at that moment, it was particularly refreshing to hear Arrau's Liszt because I'd just been hearing some other recordings of Liszt pieces, and the main impression that I was taking away was of this kind of feeling of hysteria or pyrotechnical bravura, or both at the same time. And while it's certainly true that Liszt did write certain works which gave a lot of opportunities for pyrotechnics or bravura, in his greatest works it always seems to me that virtuosity should be sublimated to the deeper musical image. There's almost always a poetic idea behind everything that Liszt wrote. The hysteria that I oftentimes hear in performances of Liszt's works doesn't seem to be reflected in Liszt's notation. In fact, it usually seems to be exactly opposite to what Liszt notated in his scores. So as an example of this, let's look at a piece which I believe is one of the most sinned against of all. This is Feux, follets from the Transcendental Etudes. This Will-o'-the-Wisp would be the translation, I think. So again, worth keeping that poetic idea in mind. The will-o'-the-wisps would be phantasms of light that travelers might see over the marshes that might lead them astray. So it is really a ghost story, a ghost piece in that way. This piece is also interesting insofar as it actually contains a metronome marking that originates with Liszt. Liszt says allegretto, so a moderately lively tempo, and he writes between 120 to 126 for the eighth note. And Liszt, in contrast to many of his contemporaries and near contemporaries like maybe Chopin and Schumann, Beethoven also might be good examples, actually he wrote very practical, well-considered metronome markings. He had this in common with Brahms. Brahms felt that you should come back to metronome markings many times before trying to write one in a score for a composition, because you really need to have perspective and to come back many times in order to really find the tempo that will really work in performance. So I usually find that Liszt pretty much hits it right on the head with his metronome markings, and that's certainly the case here. So 120 is about this speed. And that's not what you usually hear. You don't usually hear allegretto or anywhere near 120 or 126. People usually start the first page around 200 for the eighth note, almost twice as fast. And then, of course, they slow down once the main theme comes around on the next page. This is where the writing gets particularly difficult. This is the etude part of the piece with these double notes. So most versions slow down to about 160 or so, something like that. So again, for me, it's very exciting, but the effect musically is one of frenzy, near insanity, really. It's like the will-o'-the-wisps are actually buzzing around the listener's ears and trying to sting you to death or something like that. So just as an example, I'm going to play a little bit of a really excellent recording. This is oftentimes lauded as being one of the best renditions of this piece. This is Evgeny Kissin's recording. And I'm not trying to pick on Kissin especially. This is very much in line with how people usually play the piece. So this is mechanically incredible playing, but at the same time, for me, it's absolutely musically unforgivable. He's taken a piece which is a very interesting, unconventional kind of piece, a very unusual kind of sound. It's supposed to be a ghost story of sorts, a one in a million kind of piece, and he's transformed it into just another clattery, virtuoso tightrope act. Again, this is not just Kissin. Lots of people play it like this. But, this kind of razor-sharp sound, the death-defying kind of tightrope effects, the hyperactive quality, it's really horrifying if you've taken any kind of a careful look at Liszt's notation and what he wrote in the score and the kind of poetic image that he was really probably trying to get across. So this is definitely a place where Liszt, I think, is proven objectively to have just have had far better taste than most of his interpreters. Most people are just led astray by their ability to play something very fast, and they're not really paying much attention to the poetic image that Liszt had in mind. Since most recordings are like this, you may have never even heard the piece as Liszt originally conceived it, allegretto. So please try to get rid of any kind of preconceived notion you might have about how fast this piece should be, and let's hear Arrau's version. Arrau always followed his own lights. He never copied anyone else while preparing his own interpretations. That's one of the greatest things about him. So let's just hear what he makes of this. Very different, isn't it? Arrau, really, he's hitting the metronome mark just about exactly on the head. He plays with freedom, but still, it's basically at that tempo. Also, he approaches the piece in a much more orchestral kind of way, a much more rhythmically taut way. Notice that the opening is in the same tempo as the main theme. So who would have thought? Who would have thought of just playing the opening of the piece in tempo instead of trying to play it as fast as possible in order to show off like most people do? Once you hear it in the proper kind of comparison, it really comes off as being almost kind of insulting to the audience. Playing the easy part much faster than the rest just because you want to kind of make something that sounds impressive. And unfortunately, that leads to people in the audience, being very impressed by that and getting kind of addicted to this, hyper-technical sound, which is very fascinating in its own right, but which leads you astray. It leads you away from the finer musical points which are present in this music. So the performance is kind of being a little bit of a will-o'-the-wisp itself, I suppose. Ironic. So I wouldn't be surprised, and I wouldn't blame you if you have a very hard time appreciating Arrau's version if you're not used to hearing it at that tempo. The hyperactive, super fast version is very exciting, and if you get used to that, at first it's very hard to accept a slower version. It'll just sound maybe painful to you. However, if you can get used to it, I think you'll find in the long run that it's much more beautiful and evocative, and there's much more color, much more richness in the sound, much more detail and beauty. So to give a little bit of a fuller comparison, let's hear one more segment back to back, Kissin and then Arrau. This is the ending. So here's Kissin's version. And once again, Arrau. So again, I realize this is subjective. For me, the Kissin version is almost comical. It's so rushed and exaggeratedly fast. He can't really do the markings, like the pianissimo marking at the end, because of how fast it is. And the final arpeggiated chords are so abrupt, they have no meaning at all. They sound just inconsequential, just like a kind of thrown off ending. With Arrau, on the other hand, we can really savor kind of the poetry and magic of the end. And the last rolled chords have time to make their effect. You can really hear the silence in between them. So it comes off as magical instead of rushed. And there's kind of a storybook enchantment to the whole thing. So by this time, I'm convincing myself more than ever that Arrau was indeed the greatest Liszt player who ever lived, just because he could really bring to life the nobility of Liszt's nature, his generosity of spirit and musical imagination. And I think that's way more important than the technical qualities of Liszt's writing, as impressive as they are. It also reinforces to me how dangerous technical facility can be if it isn't directed in a thoughtful way. It's one of the most important things to have this kind of technical command over your instrument, but if you're not able to control it, it can really take you to places which are injurious to the music. Now, there's another problem that I often find in interpretations of Liszt's works, especially in his most profound and musically serious utterances. Somehow, these pieces oftentimes seem to be transformed into something akin to salon music. Somehow they get to be cheapened a little bit. More and more I find that Liszt thought in orchestral terms in his piano writing, and we need to have that kind of bird's eye view when we realize his piano music in order to fully get the effect he was after. As some corroboration of what I'm saying, I'd like to quote Liszt himself. He said this to a pupil in the 1850s. He was referring to a pianist that he particularly liked, and he said, "What I like about that pianist is that he is not a mere finger virtuoso. He does not worship the keyboard of the pianoforte. It is not his patron saint, but simply the altar before which he pays homage to the idea of the tone composer." This is an extraordinary statement coming from a composer who was supposed to be a mere show-off, and he's often played like that, whatever he wrote in the music himself. So I want to play one more really eye-opening comparison. This is the opening of what, for me, is one of Liszt's most beautiful and greatest works. This is the Benediction of God in Solitude, another very rarely played, little-known piece, but of incredible beauty, a stunning construction. So first, we will hear an excerpt from a really wonderful recording by the English pianist Stephen Hough. So again, this is actually superlative piano playing. It's very elegant, very flowing, many lovely tonal effects, subtle pedaling, a great deal of toying with the rhythm in kind of a playful but effective way. Now let's hear how Arrau approaches this same segment. So it's very different. And for me, it's really night and day. And I don't want to be flippant about it. I mean, as wonderful as Hough's playing is, though, I mean, it somehow strikes me as being kind of trite in comparison. I hate to say it. You know, there's kind of a breadth and nobility of sentiment in Arrau's conception. And it's odd, you know, because from a pianistic standpoint, Arrau doesn't do many things that are very special. You know, he doesn't toy with the rhythm. It's a much slower tempo. There aren't so many special pedal effects or tonal effects, really, in his playing. It's a little bit more rough in a way. But there's this wonderful sense of space and richness and singing that is just so unbelievable. It really just seems to come straight from the heart. So again, hearing these two performances side by side reminds me of another story about Liszt recounted by William Mason. William Mason, by the way, was a very interesting figure, and he was the first American student that Liszt had during the 1850s. So this quote comes from the second part of Alan Walker's magnificent Liszt biography, and here's what Mason said. Julian Schulhoff came to Weimar and played in the drawing room of the Altenburg immediately after Liszt. The Altenburg was Liszt's home in Weimar, by the way. And on the same piano, Liszt played his Benediction, and the strains of this mighty conception had scarcely dissolved into silence when Schulhoff followed with some small salon piece of his own. He produced a quality of tone far more beautiful than Liszt's, but about the latter's performance there was intellectuality and the indescribable impressiveness of genius, which made Schulhoff's playing, with all its beauty, seem tame by contrast. So this quote really resonated for me when I heard this performance for the first time. You know, it really was a step forward in my understanding of what Liszt is really all about. I think that in this performance there's a kind of raw, unfiltered emotion which really ends up moving me like no other. So again, I could go on, but I think I've basically made enough of a point for now. And I'd like to make some disclaimer as well. I mean, it's not like I would necessarily recommend imitating everything Arrau does. Not all of his Liszt recordings are equally exciting to me, especially some of the ones that he made later in his life in the 80s that can sound a little bit more tired or labored. But when he was at his best, there's really something very awe-inspiring and noble about what he does. So I would single out his recordings, his studio recordings of the B minor Sonata, B minor Ballade, Valet Dobermann, Transcendental Etudes, the two concert etudes, and the Benediction. These recordings all remain some of the greatest recordings of all time of anything, Liszt or otherwise. And even if I disagree in details, I really get this feeling that Arrau understood Liszt's personality and spirit. I sense a meeting of musical minds that were, in some ways at least, very much aligned in seriousness of intent and imagination. So I hope you find this interesting, and I encourage you strongly to go out there, take a listen to some of Arrau's Liszt playing, and report back. Let me know what you think. Please, leave comments if you like Arrau's playing, if you hate it, if you have other ideas. I'd be interested to read them. I try to respond to everyone's comments, but I don't always get there because I get a lot of comments now these days, so it's hard for me sometimes to field them all. But I do really love to read what you have to write, so please do that. And also, please support the channel by liking the video and subscribing if you want to see more content like this. Thank you to my loyal Patreon's supporters as well, who support the channel financially each and every month through patreon.com. If you would like to join the growing host of people who are trying to help me bring you this content, then you can do that at www.patreon.com/independent pianist. Also, if you'd like to hear me live, feel free to book me for a concert. You can reach me at cole@independentpianist.com and we can discuss that. Or if you'd like to study the piano online, I do teach some very dedicated students online, so feel free to drop me an email at that same address and we can have a consultation. So thank you very much for watching, and be sure to stay tuned to next week. I'll have some more great music and conversation coming up for you. So until then, please take care.